And now I will introduce today's speakers. Kevin Long, his litigation practice focuses in the defense of corporate clients on matters ranging from post-acquisition litigation to warranty and other litigation under the Uniform Commercial Code. A significant amount of Kevin's practice is within the construction, real estate, and transportation industries. Kevin also advises clients on a variety of construction litigation matters. He is an MBA-trained attorney with a civil engineering background. Turning to Mark Ehrman. Mark is a corporate services attorney whose practice focuses on representing companies and their owners and investors in domestic and international stock and asset acquisitions and other corporate reorganizations and public and private financing. Mark has worked with a number of startup and emerging companies and their investors by assisting them with forming their companies, completing agreements among founders and employees, protecting IP, and securing angel and venture capital financing. Steve Gardner, his practice focuses on IP-related transactions and litigation. He works with both national and startup companies, as well as research institutions and other IP owners. He has advised clients on all types of IP matters in a variety of technologies, including matters relating to software, magnetic resonance imaging, CT imaging, medical devices, industrial equipment, and processors and electronic controllers. Randy Euler, his practice focuses on representing motor vehicle manufacturers and distributors in the automotive, motorcycle, and power sports industries. His vehicle distribution experience includes advising clients on a wide variety of vehicle distribution matters they confront in their day-to-day business operations. He also counsels clients on the development and structuring of novel programs and initiatives aimed to capitalize on new technologies and emerging market trends, such as subscription vehicle services, online vehicle sales, and other customer-centric initiatives. Nick Schmidbauer is a partner and chair of the consumer product subgroup of the firm's IP practice group. His practice focuses on all aspects of litigation, counseling, and IP procurement and enforcement. Nick regularly advises clients in nearly every technology space, including those producing and or selling autonomous driving systems, cell phone equipment, and software. Now I will turn it over to Kevin, Mark, Stephen, Randy, and Nick. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kim. As Kim mentioned, or at least inferred, I'm Kevin Long, a member of our commercial litigation group, and I can attest from working with our colleagues on our team, including the speakers, that almost half of what Kim said was accurate with respect to this description. So that's a pretty good start. Now, actually, it's a great group we've assembled together. I am here, as the introduction indicated, as a litigator because I've personally designed an autonomous vehicle. No, I haven't. I haven't done that. But the breadth of the practices of the speakers you're going to hear from today is illustrative of just how impactful these changes can be, from real estate to corporate to litigation, IP, and pretty much everything that business is. It's very hard to find a business to whom this type of a change is not going to impact that business. Today, we're not going to have time to get into great depth with respect to any of these issues. This is sort of an autonomous vehicle 101 type presentation. We're going to talk about 6 different areas. I'm going to give you an overview of the state and federal regulatory and legislative updates, different things that are happening in the states and the federal government. Mark Ehrman in Madison is going to talk to us about various testing sites. There are dozens of testing sites happening throughout the country. You hear about it all the time. He'll give you a little more detail on that. Steve Gardner is going to talk to you about joint development agreements in this space. Most everything that's happening in this space revolves cooperation of some sort between different businesses, different industries. That's a critical piece of it. Obviously, inferentially, IP issues become really important. Nick Schmidbauer has experience dealing with all those things. He's going to talk about that. And lastly, Randy Euler has specific experience dealing with and helping people see around the corner with respect to how this change is going to impact distribution channels and how people buy goods and services. I'll finish up with a couple different things about litigation updates. There are people surprisingly starting to think about whether their rights have been violated by others and different forms of litigation. So we'll talk a little bit about that at the end. Before I begin, I want to thank a couple of folks who've been instrumental in helping us put this presentation together and really develop this effort. It first came out of our feedback from our clients. So I first want to thank our clients, because when we talk to our clients through formal and informal surveys and feedback, one of the questions we ask them all the time is, what's happening in your businesses? What are your biggest needs? And we kept hearing this over and over again, and a big thank you to them. Also want to shout out to Jenny Diedolf of our library staff, and Kyle Williams, one of our legal assistants here at Quarles and Brady, who really led the effort in really digging in on some of the non-legal research, but rather the technical research as to what's happening in the industry. And at the end of the presentation, you'll see a number of folks who've joined our team. So I'll dive right into the regulatory and legislative roles. A little bit of a background. First, you figure out, okay, who's really regulates things that happen on highways? And really, it's an overlap between the states and the feds. If you think about it, the federal government through the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, which is a part of the United States Department of Transportation, they enforce safety standards. They tell you what can be in a vehicle, what can go on a highway, and they're responsible for the federal highway system. They regulate fuel economy standards. They regulate things like that. The state's role, of course, all of us have had the joy of sitting in line at the DMV, getting our driver's license. They have the rules there. They also govern the rules of the road. There's all sorts of overlapping rules, as there are in all portions of government. You know, an example is when you're funding highways, you get some federal money and you get some federal regulations you need to comply with. States are heavily involved. Local governments are heavily involved. And you see that playing out. In the realm of autonomous vehicles, to be perfectly honest, the roles could be a little bit more clear than they are now. They're becoming, there's lots of ambiguity being created. That's being created, I think, because of good faith actions by lots of folks. But everybody is seeing this change coming. I think this is not Y2K. I think this is reached the point where this is a when, not if issue. It's a question of how fast does this come and how does it happen. It's not going to be a situation where this is not going to happen. So people are realizing that. States are trying to get ahead of each other and become sort of the hotbed or the place to be in this particular technology. 27 states have enacted some form of legislation. Executive orders have come out, so many states have done both in that regard. This is sort of a primer, and I apologize to those of you in the audience who may be well down the road in understanding these issues, but I'm going to do a couple of basics. These are called the SAE levels of automation, 0 through 5, 6 different levels. And this is nomenclature that's used throughout the literature and throughout the regulations. 0 is your car with no cruise control, with nothing, not quite Fred Flintstone, but just north of Fred Flintstone. Driver assistance is what many of us are with now. You've got a cruise control, you've got something. Some of the higher end cars have those self-park cars, those type things. Partial automation, 2, that's generally where your Teslas are, those type of things. Right now, there's debate about whether we've reached level 3 with some of the cars that are commercially available, and 4 and then 5 are the fully automated vehicles. If you're also looking for a baseline, you're trying to figure out, how do I understand what's going on here? The place that I would direct you to is the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration has a series of documents. ADS 2.0 is the version now. It came out last September. It was preceded by ADS 1.0, and it will be followed by ADS 3.0. It's a document that deals with a number of these issues, and they have promised this summer to come out with 3.0. It deals with a whole bunch of issues. I've listed them here on the next slide, including nomenclature. What do we mean? What are the issues? And one of the things that the NHTSA has been very focused on is this is mainly about safety. And one of the issues here that we all find ourselves in our mind thinking, oh geez, what's going on with these autonomous vehicles? Are they unsafe? I don't really trust them. And we've had a couple of highly publicized accidents and deaths, and one death, actually a couple of deaths in autonomous vehicles. But the number of highway deaths nationally, just in the United States, is 37,000 per year. And if you look at that number, and you look at the impact of this technology on the overall safety, I don't think there's anybody who spent much time thinking about it that doesn't realize that this is actually going to really help safety in the long term. But there are going to be some challenges. That report gives guidance to states and local governments about the kind of areas and best practices that they would like to see. The states, many governors have created commissions to look at this issue, and most of the people that have looked at the issue have come back to this document in order to sort of get their bearings. So that's a document that I would direct your attention to. We sent out a client alert a few days ago that has links to that document and the others since that time. So since that time in the fall, the federal this administrative agency in the federal government has been talking to lots and lots of people, getting feedback. They've held a number of different listening sessions involving industry, involved industry, sessions involving the research community, sessions involving various different industries, from motorcycles to over the road trucks and sort of everything in between. They've gone through a number of different meetings, and they've come up with basically these 6 principles. Safety is first. The second is that the approach is going to be flexible and tech neutral. The market is to determine the most effective solution. They're not, and they're explicitly saying, we don't want to pick the winners and losers here. Everybody in the background, every business everywhere is saying, yes, I don't want you to pick the winners and losers, but maybe pick me. But if you're going to pick a winner, pick me. And there's always going to be that tension, but the DOT has come up pretty strongly that that's their precept and that's what they're aiming for. When regulations are needed, again, for that same reason, they want to be non-prescriptive, performance-based. They're going to work with states and other authorities to avoid a patchwork approach. They want to provide guidance and complement technologies. They don't want to have just one technology. And they recognize, and this is an important distinction, they recognize there's never going to be a situation where it's all autonomous. So whatever it is we develop is going to need to be able to live with safely with human-operated vehicles. So they're not going for the home run where we're going to have large swaths of the population where human vehicles are not going to be able to be operated. Human-driven vehicles are not going to be able to be operated. I'm going to turn a little bit next to legislative efforts. Legislative efforts have not, on the federal level, have not reached any passed law. There have been a couple of different efforts. There's something called the Self-Drive Act. That is, both the Self-Drive Act came out of the House. The AV START Act came out of the Senate. Both of them are nominees for the acronym Hall of Fame because they, I can't even remember what they say, but they all stand for one particular word that somebody came up with there. The House passed its act. The Senate passed Commerce Committee, but has not been called for a vote for the full Senate. Along the way in that process, a couple of significant things have occurred. One is that over-the-road trucking, commercial trucking has been taken completely out of that legislation. That was driven primarily by the Teamsters Union and concern with respect to its impact on labor force. Industry's response to that is that that's an unwarranted concern because they believe in the commercial vehicles. There's always going to be an analogy made by one trucking executive is that where they see the future is not so much that there won't be a human being in these trucks, but it'll be more like an airline pilot than a driver, somebody who's monitoring and driving things that may have an impact on the ability of truckers to stay on the road longer and have greater productivity in that regard. The AV START Act, which is the Senate Act, looks at a number of different things and gives the Department of Transportation a year to amend certain regs, or else it will adopt regs that have been proposed by something called the Volpe Report, something that happened prior to that. The opponents are concerned about it for a number of reasons. They're concerned about the preemption of state safety regulations. There's a concern that there would be an exemption of liability in certain areas, and they're concerned that it doesn't deal with cybersecurity and privacy protection. State legislation has occurred in a number of different ways, and a lot of states have passed laws that many of which are just, this is really important to us, we should look at this, we should create a commission, we should be open to testing. That's sort of your standard variety piece of state legislation or executive order. Some states, however, have gone much further, and particularly Michigan, obviously the home of the auto industry, has passed fairly fulsome legislation that provides some protection for manufacturers and has had some concern for consumer groups. These are a couple of different examples in Arizona. It's sort of the standard executive order saying we need to look forward to this, we need to be open to technology. Platooning is a term that means when you have one driver and your number of vehicles that are connected and moving together down the road, maybe not connected physically, but connected electronically. Wisconsin had a steering committee that just issued a report on June 28th, and that's available online as well. Here's a little bit about Michigan's efforts. Really, they define particular terms and they exempt certain shops from liability and do a number of other things that really try to streamline the testing, eliminate some of the risks from the business side, but then also give some protections that some consumer groups are a little wary of. One thing, if you think about, this is kind of a marriage of the tech world and the automotive world, and those are really different worlds. And if you think about the click-through terms and conditions that you sign your life away when you're buying a piece of software, you compare that to the very consumer-friendly, not just the various consumer laws that deal with vehicle performance and injury, but also issues related to dealers. Those are very different worlds. So you will see those things changing and lots of legislation going forward. And I predict there's going to be a lot of different changes. I'm going to turn it over to Mark Ehrman now in Madison. One of the things that the US DOT put in place was a number of different testing regimes, and Mark's going to walk you through those.
Thanks, Kevin. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm coming to you from Madison. As Kevin mentioned, I'm a member of Business Law Group. My name is Mark Ehrman. I'm going to do the Testing 101 piece of this presentation. So as Kevin mentioned, as part of the rolling out of the ADS 2.0, the DOT on January 19, 2017 designated 10 sites as autonomous vehicle proving grounds to develop the testing procedures and protocols consistent with the 6 basic principles that Kevin mentioned. There were dozens of applicants for these facilities, different types of facilities, and the idea is they were designed and selected to pick the sites that would do the most wide variety of testing and develop best practice around it. Now, just one thing interesting as an aside, for those of you looking at dates, that happens to be the last day of President Obama's full day of his administration. So I don't know if there's any significance to that, but I just thought that was interesting. So these are the 10 sites. You can see that there's a combination of some governmental sites. There's a U.S. Army facility in Maryland. There's some private and quasi-public facilities. There's a University of Wisconsin here in our own backyard has a testing facility here. So there's a number of different testing facilities, all spending a lot of money looking at a lot of different types of technology with the idea that eventually they will collaborate together. And as part of developing the ADS 3.0, the ADS 4.0, they'll use the best practices and work together to develop better technologies with the idea that they want to go from the 0 level of automation, which Kevin mentioned, up to the 5 eventually. Now, these aren't the only testing facilities in the country. There's a lot of other ones. And I just put a few up on the screen there. Arizona has a number of automobile makers have facilities there. Florida, Michigan has a number of facilities, and I'll mention one in a few minutes. That's kind of interesting. But you can see the facilities are around the country, and again, there's just a lot of different efforts in this area. So what are they testing? Well, I mean, it's obvious that with safety being the biggest concern, they need to deal with unknown events. It's fairly easy to program a vehicle to drive straight in a straight line in perfect conditions. Well, as we all know, that's not the way driving works. Up here, if you're in the Midwest, you could have a deer jump out in front of you. How does the vehicle react to that? Bad weather, bad road conditions are other factors. Sometimes the bad road conditions are caused by bad weather. You have to design vehicles that can interact in those situations. And they're also testing what's the best fuel economy and efficiency for these vehicles. Braking and acceleration, how does that work as far as, turning corners and merging? All those things are being looked at to develop the best, most economical type of vehicle. And then how does this impact the environment? Obviously, with the autos we have today, there's a large carbon footprint. They're trying to reduce that, and the hope is that they can do that. Accessibility is another one. When you think about it, if you have a job most times and you don't have a vehicle, your job prospects are limited to where you can get using mass transit. Well, this opens up a whole new level of opportunities for people to work in areas where they may not have worked now. And so does that mean that it supplements or replaces existing transportation? And then the whole idea of big data, that's very important. As these tests are being rolled out, they're just gathering tons of data. Now that data can obviously be used in further developing the vehicles, but it has applications in a lot of other areas, insurance and other things. So they're using that data and testing that data, how they can use it in other fields. So this is an interesting map. It's a little hard to read on the screen, but this is on the University of Wisconsin's testing website. And it's ironic that because it's the University of Wisconsin, they use a cow in the slide. But this shows you how one vehicle might work. And all the vehicles are going to have their own GPS unit and onboard base map. They're also going to have several cameras, which in the picture are the red circles. So those will be around the vehicle. Then they're going to have several radars. In this case, the radars are the purple squares, and those are in the front of the vehicle. You know, the radars bounce beams, obviously, and detect objects, but they can't really differentiate among objects. So the key to this technology really would be the LiDARs, which are the things in green triangles in this. And LiDAR, when you think about it, it's basically bouncing laser lights off of objects and seeing how long it takes to come back. The technology has been around since the 60s. It just so happens that this is very good technology used in automobiles. And if you've ever seen an autonomous vehicle or picture, it's the kind of weird looking thing on top of the vehicle that spins around. Now, in this particular example, they show 3 LiDARs. I think the idea would be to have more, because the more you have, the better the vehicle works. Obviously, there's a cost associated with that. So this is one example of what the University of Wisconsin is developing for its vehicles. So let me talk about, I mentioned that M-City, which is a testing facility in Michigan, and I think it's probably one of the most unique facilities in the country. It's a combination of public-private partnership. Michigan is the leader in this, University of Michigan. They donated the land, and they have several of their departments involved in it. But there's also over 60 industry partners, and you'll see up on the screen, there's a number of automobile manufacturers, insurance companies, State Farm being the leader, technology companies that are developing technology to be used in the vehicles, and then the other partners, suppliers to automobile companies, consultants, and service providers. And there's also the state, local, and federal government in Michigan involved. Kevin mentioned that Michigan's been kind of the leader in this. Obviously, they're kind of the home of the traditional automobile manufacturers, so they're really taking this to another level. And they've developed something called the M-City Shuttle, and if you go on their website, you'll see a video of it. It's the first driverless shuttle I think that's being operated in the country. It operates from 9 to 3 during the week. It goes around the Michigan North Campus, if anybody's familiar with that campus. It's a 1-mile loop, and it picks up and drops off passengers. And there is a person on board that can override if need be, but it was just rolled out in June 4th. So it's kind of the first test shuttle of its kind. Here's a map, and this is really hard to read on the screen, but if you get a chance to look online, it's interesting. This shows what the facility looks like. It's a self-contained facility. It's designed to simulate both urban and suburban type road conditions. There's different types of lanes. There's curved lanes. There's a freeway to the right, that kind of a mini freeway that shows on ramps and off ramps. There's traffic signals, different types of pavement, gravel, clean pavement. There's loose pavement. They use different signage, and there's also some movable buildings, which you can't really see very well on the slide, but they can move around almost like a movie set, where they can station them at different locations around the facility to see where how these vehicles work. And any of the industry partners with M-City can reserve this facility for a period of time, and then when it's your facility, you have exclusive use to it. So nobody else can get in there. It's secure. You do your testing. For example, if Mercedes-Benz wants to do tests for a week, they reserve the facility for a week. They do their testing, and then the next group uses it. So what's going to be considered in the future? Obviously, as I mentioned, dealing with unpredictable events and circumstances, with safety being the overriding concern, you need to make sure that these vehicles work in a wide variety of conditions. in unusual road conditions in big cities, urban areas, and suburban areas. How will the machine learning help the process? Machine learning is just running millions of scenarios through a computer. The more scenarios you run through a computer, the better the computer reacts. So if you can continue to build up the robustness of the technology so that it has seen so many different variations, it'll work better. How does the handoff process work? Kevin mentioned that it's going to be decades before we get to the point of having a purely driverless car. So there will always be the need, at least in the foreseeable future, for the driver to take over. And in the not too distant future, there may be situations where as a driver, you can be doing stuff on your computer in the car, you can be watching movies, you can be listening to whatever, but you need to be able to take over in a very short time. So how does that handoff work? And that's going to be a very key to developing safe cars. Another question is, can these things be made in a large scale and efficient way so that they actually get universal adoption? Right now, the technology is there to develop it, but it's very expensive. And so, while not everybody may have their own cars, some people may decide, there may just be a fleet of cars that you can call up on an app, which might be in a chip in your arm in a few years, and say, just meet me at my office and take me here. There still needs to be an efficient and affordable way to make these so that it works with the large scale population. And then the ethical question of how do you deal with the trolley problem? The trolley problem is a situation where if an accident is unavoidable, how does the machine determine which way to go? So for example, if I'm driving my car with my family and my choice is either to drive into a semi that's in front of me or veer off and hit a group of school kids who are in a bus, maybe off the side of the road, my natural reaction as a driver is to swerve off and hit those people, where that might mean that there's actually more injury and damage doing that than letting my car run right into the back of the semi. So and there's a lot of different ethical questions around that. What if the people in my car are in their 80s, and that I don't have any answers to that, but that's going to be a key thing in developing how this technology works, because at some point in time you're going to have to teach the car to make those types of decisions, which are now made by humans. So that's a very quick and very fast overview of Testing 101. I'm going to now turn over my colleague sitting on my right, Steve Gardner.
Thanks, Mark. Thank you, Mark. As Mark mentioned, my name is Steve Gardner, and I'm a member of the IP group here at Quarles and Brady. I focus my practice on transactions and agreements relating to technology, the creation of technology and commercialization, as well as strategies for how to protect intellectual property in the software and high-tech space in the presence of as much collaboration as goes on in an industry like the autonomous vehicles and connected car industry. And I'll try and move through my slides quickly in the interest of time, but there's a couple of points that I want to make about why this autonomous vehicle and connected car industry is creating some unique difficulties and challenges that weren't always already present in the automotive industry. Given the amount of testing, first of all, that goes into this, and the tragic results of an autonomous vehicle system not doing what it's supposed to do, all of the manufacturers, component suppliers, programmers are going to have to work together to understand why an accident happened, which means they're going to need to know how each other's technology works to really coordinate things, and that means a lot of collaboration. And because the person in a car that's autonomous is not technically the driver anymore, they might want to be watching Netflix, or they might want their car to be their office. In essence, anything you could do on your cell phone and at your desk is going to be happening inside of a car. And so if you are a manufacturer of some content, or HD radio or Netflix or something like that, you're now grouped in with people who are controlling how a car works. You might be susceptible to hacking that you didn't really have to worry about before. You're a part of an integrated system that's a target for all kinds of different tragedies and complexities. And so, people who are entertainment oriented might worry about privacy issues. People who are dealing with GPS might not have had to deal with that issue, but now because they're all in the same system that's merging all these technologies, they're going to have to work together to solve these problems. Another unique thing is, as cars become autonomous, the kind of whole thought process and scheme for who is a customer and who's a competitor is changing. And one good example of this is GM has this app called Maven. And if you've ever seen in some cities, they have these zip cars where it's sort of an on-demand car. Well, Maven is an app where you tell it what kind of car you want. It tells you where to go, and it's a Chevy Bolt is the car that's most frequently used. Well, as soon as that Chevy Bolt is autonomous, GM's Maven app is essentially the same thing as Uber or Lyft. And now GM's customer, who is Lyft, becomes its direct competitor because GM can do exactly what Lyft was doing. And so people sort of approach the sharing of technology and information with a customer one way. They're much more guarded with a competitor. But I think now when there's collaboration going on, people have to be a little more concerned about whether the person you're working with will someday either replace your technology or become your competitor. And we're seeing this happen with some of our clients right now. You've got sort of the established manufacturers. Maybe you make a key fob for entry into a car, or you make a steering wheel. These things might not be necessary in an autonomous car anymore. And so these app manufacturers in Silicon Valley or wherever are coming up with solutions, and they're talking to the existing companies right now about what's going on in the automotive industry. Teach us about what happens. And historically, you'd always worry about the big company stealing the idea from the smaller startup company. And now kind of the reverse is happening, where the bigger companies are collaborating with startups and sort of teaching them the industry, and then the startup disrupts the industry, and there's no need for these established manufacturers. Likewise, in one example, for cybersecurity, companies may be working together for really altruistic purposes. And the last thing anyone wants is an autonomous vehicle being hacked and driven into a crowd. So everyone should be working together to create as safe a car as possible. But in doing that, you will necessarily be having all of these, softwares and design specs, software code and design specs being shared among everyone who's contributing to a vehicle, and that's going to cause inevitably the IP leak and ideas that are proprietary, one company making their way into the design plans of other companies. So how can this be dealt with? I think it has to be a balancing, like most things. On the one hand, companies that play it too close to the vest, are too rigid about guarding their technology, are missing out. You're too hard to work with, people won't work with you. And in this space, there is going to be a standard for how autonomous vehicles work. And if you aren't playing well with others, you might get left out. As soon as there's a standard, you're out in the cold, whether that's the standard for, how people watch TV in a car, or the standard for, as Mark was talking about, how the cameras assess, what is an object we should avoid. On the other hand, where companies are too lax and not thinking about the types of things they have that are valuable, whether that's just existing industry knowledge for what works in cars, or actual patented invention, as those get shared back and forth, if you're too lax, you can get replaced, or you're just generating competitors. And so I think there's really three ways that companies have tried to go about this, and each has pros and cons. I'll try and go through them quickly. The first is just a joint development agreement or a collaboration agreement. These can be called whatever terminology you prefer, but the idea is to have an agreement or a template or approach that allows your engineers to define, here's what our company has, here's our expertise, this is our IP. Whoever you're collaborating with can do the same. You parse who owns what, so that when we come out of this, we can say the result of this will be used by this person in this field, or by the other company in that field, but you're just thinking ahead and laying it all out. And a lot of times I think companies reach the point of a confidentiality agreement when they should already be at a joint development. And that's the one case I have there, the Goodyear case. Coda was a startup that had a technology for a self-inflating tire for an electric vehicle. They approached Goodyear and they're pitching this idea, and they've got a confidentiality agreement, but not a joint development agreement. And so in the course of this, the engineers start talking and they riff on Coda's idea, and they come up with a new technology. There's no long-term plan put in place. Both sides go on their own way. And a few years later, Coda sees that Goodyear had filed a patent for basically an improvement on Coda's idea. A joint development agreement would have dictated how that had to happen and who would have notified each other. But all they had was a confidentiality agreement. And under IP law, Goodyear wound up owning that patent and cut Coda out of the business. And so I think because this technology moves so fast and engineers are so prone to want to start collaborating because the amount of work to get these systems to interface is tremendous, that a confidentiality agreement alone really isn't always enough. And by the time those things even get signed, it probably already needs to be a JDA. One of the drawbacks of this is the transaction cost that needs to be negotiated and executed every time for each purpose to govern what's going to happen. One alternative to that is a joint venture. I've seen less of this in the autonomous vehicle space, but it does sometimes make sense. More complicated to initiate, but it solves a lot of intractable problems with IP ownership. You don't have to say who owns what, the JV owns the results of this collaboration. Then you can just talk about who's going to move forward with technology from there and how you're going to divvy up the pie of profit. And the last one that I'll talk about, I think, is a really interesting model here. And this is sort of an open sharing model. And in the space, because there's going to be so much content and so much standardization that's delivered, companies are balancing the risk of some of their IP becoming known in the market and the competitors knowing more about how their processes work with the fact that they want content. They want developers using their platform. They want companies, the big car manufacturers, to adopt their platform. And so they're making that risk assessment early on and deciding we're okay with everyone knowing something about how our technology works. We're going to let it out there. Maybe it's a full open source decision that's made to just give away some of your software. Maybe it's something slightly short of that. But just they're taking a strategic approach to tailoring what they're giving away so that they can maximize adoption and content, because they don't want to be left out because of how fast this industry is moving. Ford is an example of this. Right now, if you want to, you can go on to GitHub, which is an open source repository, and get the actual code of part of Ford's sync system. And they were one of the first to do that because they want content on their infotainment system. They want people developing apps. They want people to have interconnected devices with that car, because having users and adoption is a competitive advantage. They also did a slightly different tweak on that, which is sort of an open source light model, where internally among their suppliers and vendors and their different divisions, they've posted a lot of their code and solutions that they found that work, because they know eventually these things are all going to be interconnected, and they want speed in terms of how new functionality can get developed. So they're sharing a lot, and they've made that decision that that's better for them than trying to play it close to the vest. So the takeaways here are, because this industry is moving so fast and there's so much collaboration, you're better off being proactive and intentional in deciding right now, assessing right now what's going to be shared with other companies, and take an approach that's going to enable engineers to share things in a way that doesn't have unreasonable restrictions. Having to negotiate an agreement, whether that's terms and conditions or joint development agreement, every time there's a collaboration results in IP leak. It's just, the legal department will be circumvented. Reactionary ad hoc approaches doesn't promote consistency. You might even have the right agreements in place for every situation, but it's too different and too complex, and the engineers won't understand it, and they'll just start collaborating despite what the agreements say. So consider the risks and benefits of giving away some or all of your technology. Make a reasonable agreement, whether that's terms and conditions for giving software away or a joint development agreement. Put reasonable terms in it. Don't ask to own everything. Don't make it something that's being negotiated every time. Just accept that collaboration is inevitable, and then always read the fine print and understand that all the other players in this industry are doing the same thing. And so your folks collaborating with others are probably signing or clicking accept on terms and conditions from other people that could have an impact for you. So really, internal education, the more collaboration that takes place, internal education about what can and can't be signed is really key. And with that, I will turn it over to Nick to talk about IP protection.
Thank you. I think that a lot of people conventionally think of IP in this realm as being just patents, and that is true to some extent, but we can't think that there's trademarks, there's trade dress, there's trade secrets. And typically what I've seen over the past couple of years is that most players are protecting their IP by keeping it secret. But as this technology becomes more forward-facing, when the consumers are actually touching it, seeing it, we have to be concerned about other people potentially taking it, stealing it, using it. And so that's why we think that utility patents are probably going to be the future in terms of how we're going to primarily protect this type of innovation. Also, designs are increasingly becoming important in this landscape too. How users interact and interface with this technology will be really important. So if we look to see the trends that are occurring, the last 20 years, you had maybe 30 filings back in 1997, and it's just exploded. The last year, we almost had 2,800 filings in this autonomous vehicle area for utility patent applications. Now, digging into it, who's actually filing these types of applications? So there are a lot of traditional car companies. You have your Fords or GMs and players like that. But you also have Boeing, dealing with autonomous, vehicles in the air, drones. You have FedEx dealing with, transport vehicles. You have lots of other players, like in the heavy machinery area, Deere, Caterpillar. So there's a lot of people in this landscape that you might think of, but there's others, disruptors, like Google. So if you look at the top 4 filers in this area, 3 are car companies, but one is actually one that you wouldn't traditionally think of being in this landscape. And so I think that's one of the big takeaways from this slide. But another is the fact that Ford has filed an enormous number of applications in this landscape, this space, far more than GM or Toyota. And so they're up to something. And actually, if you were reading the papers yesterday, you saw that they're going to go under a massive restructuring. And there's also talk of creating an autonomous car division. So if you're comparing what that company is doing with others, they are far outpacing the rest of their competitors, which is an interesting insight. Now, if you're in this space, you also have to worry about navigation. You can't have a car that has the ability to move by itself, but not actually navigate to a particular place from a spot that you started at. So there's a lot of players that are traditionally telecom companies, chip manufacturers. I mean, obviously IBM's in there. And if you look at all the filings over the history of this landscape, you've got IBM with 22,000 filings in this area. You've got a bunch of other, non-car companies who've been in this landscape for a really long time. So this knowledge has to be translated to those other traditional car companies. They got to work together somehow. When we look at the top filers, again, you can see that there aren't really traditional car companies here. But if you were to compare those 2 graphs of all the major filers, you notice there's some overlap. Qualcomm, Google, and IBM are actually big filers in both of these areas. And that'll be interesting too. And as Steve mentioned, there's a lot of collaboration going on here as well. So utility patents are going to be very important, but what's the effect of actually getting a patent on something in this area? There are increasing concerns that even if you get a patent, you can't force it. It's just not valid. And so what we're seeing right now is if you can make it through the patent office and get past these, what we call them as 101 hurdles, it's essentially the office saying, this isn't really the subject matter we think that you should get a patent on. It's just too abstract. It's related to an algorithm. It's the type of thing that you can think of in your head, and yeah, maybe you tied it to a computer, but it's just not something that we want to give a patent to. You used to be able to do this all the time. Now recently, with new law that's come out and a 2014 Supreme Court decision, it's really gotten kind of clamped down, and we're seeing a lot of these types of rejections. It's not to say people won't be filing them. It's just more difficult. So if you look at what has been happening recently, in 2016, 2 patents related to navigation technology have been invalidated. So they would have been filed under the old regime. They made it through. They were enforced, and they were knocked out. We're probably not going to see a lot of this because most of the players in this industry really do work together. So it's more likely that in the telecom realm, the people who are filing these, some of these might be standard essential patents. There's an understanding that they'll just cross-license. Maybe we won't sue each other, and everyone will be happy. But the question is, how are the traditional automotive players or the OEMs who kind of work with those automotive companies going to play in this regime? How are they going to license this technology? So that's something that we have to think about too, kind of going forward. Designs, increasingly, designs are going to become more and more important. This is how people interact with the world around them. People are tied to their cell phones. People are tied to their iPads. Everything about you, your identity is almost wrapped into, exactly how you communicate with the rest of the world. And so essentially a car, autonomous car is a big cell phone, right? You can think of it that way. And so, typically people think of, oh, well, I have a design patent on the aesthetics of something. Maybe it's to a cup holder. It's to how the car looks. But that's not all. It's to the icons on the display screen. It's how you interact with that car itself. And you can file patent applications on this. And actually, they're powerful. And so probably a bunch you've heard about the Apple-Samsung decision. I think the takeaway there is there were some utility patents that protect the functionality, but there were also design patents at play, which only protect the ornamentality. The $500-something million in damages, $529 million they got, almost all of it was tied in with the design patent. And interestingly, and I don't want to get too into the weeds here, but when you infringe a utility patent, you apportion the damages for what it is that you're particularly infringing. For designs, if you infringe a design patent, you get the fair value of the entire product. Okay, so what happened was Apple had a design patent to a GUI, a graphical user interface. And essentially the jury said, well, because the GUI uses the shape of the phone and the screen and all the electric circuitry in it, we're going to give you the value of the entire phone because you infringed just the interface and how you just click on something on the screen. And so, if you think about that, how does that translate to cars? I mean, that could be huge. I'm not saying that you're going to get the full value of the car if you file a design patent on a GUI, but maybe you get the fair value of the entire TV or the display, maybe the electronic components that go with it. So there's some danger there. And because of that, we're seeing a huge increase in filings. Just last year, we had about 1,800 issued design patents, and there's an upward trend in the GUI field. And as you can see, there are even some now traditional car companies that are getting to this place. So almost all these are from Google, Samsung, other telecom companies, phone makers. But and as I alluded to before, Ford has made a huge push. The numbers I had up before only talk about their utility patent filings. This is the design patent. They're even getting into this area too. So this is something that increasingly I think that people will start to be thinking about. And with that too, I guess I'll leave it with this, that when you think about people developing technology related to autonomous vehicles, we're talking about controllers and sensors and things like that. You probably think about a lot of infrastructure you need. You need engineers. To file a design application, you could just be in your dorm room, and you could file this. And you can even file on how an image changes over time. So something enlarges. And you can't show it anywhere else that's been done. Get a design patent on it and sue the car companies, make a lot of money. Call me first. Now I'm going to leave it over to my colleague, Randy, and take it away.
Good afternoon, everyone. One of the really interesting questions about autonomous vehicles is who's going to own them at the end of the day? And the people who own them, how are they going to go about buying them? Is this going to be done traditionally like you buy a car today where you walk into a dealership? Or is the world going to look completely different in how you buy it or even whether you own one? So it makes sense to start talking about this topic by really beginning to take a quick look at where we are today and how cars are sold today. Well, most cars, as you know, get sold through automobile dealerships. It's 80 to 85% of every car walks into somebody walking into a dealership that's not the manufacturer, but it's an independent business who buys cars from a manufacturer and sells them to you. In that situation, the role of the dealer is critical because the dealer is the interface with the retail customer, and the dealer is the person who has a certain amount of profitability that results from that transaction. There's a lot of value in the supply chain at the dealer level. There's also a number of cars get sold to fleet operators. Hertz and Enterprise might be examples of people who buy hundreds of thousands of cars. Those sales are also run through dealers by the manufacturers, but the dealer role is much, much more minimal. Many times the dealer never even touches the physical car and just makes a very token amount of money on that vehicle. The third way you can buy cars today are buying them direct, where the manufacturer itself will own a dealership location. So there's no intermediary, no intermediate dealer. And this is the model that Tesla is implementing in its sales throughout the United States. But this model is still a very, very small percentage of how cars are sold. There are laws in many states that actually prevent manufacturers from selling direct to consumers if they have dealers. And there's other states that just utterly, totally prevent manufacturers from selling cars directly to dealers. Texas, for instance, is a state that is very, very regulatory oriented and very much protects the role of the dealer, such that in that state, a manufacturer cannot come in and actually sell to a customer directly, whether or not the manufacturer has a dealer. So the question is, I think, what does this really mean? I mean, it means today that in buying and selling and owning cars, the role of the dealer really is central and foremost in everything that winds up happening. And what's interesting that many people do not know, but the relationship of the dealership with the manufacturers they represent is one that is protected and controlled by laws in each of the 50 states. So each of the 50 states has a law that give dealers certain rights with respect to how cars can be sold and what profit, in many cases, they're entitled to make on those cars. Today, though, even before we get to the autonomous vehicle, the system, this dealer-centric system, is coming under a lot of stress. Because today I think there's two things that are becoming very, very true. The first is that customers want to begin buying cars the same way they buy other things. They want to buy them where they're located, buy it at your home or online versus going to a dealership location. They want to do it through a bargaining process that's not going in and having somebody go ask their manager if the price can be met, but where they see the fixed price online or given to them at the time they buy the car. They don't want to go around price shopping. They want to know what the price is. They also want to own cars on maybe a different type of basis than they typically do. Today, it's owning it or leasing it. But what about subscribing to a car? So you can use it when you want to, but not when you don't. So I think the other thing that is becoming, the second point is becoming really interesting and dynamic in the market today, is that consumers are less and less actually wanting to own cars, but they just want to use them. So if you think, for example, Uber and Lyft, there's many people, particularly those who live in dense urban areas, they'll never own a car. They don't want to pay for the upkeep. They don't want to pay for garage space. They just want to take their phone, be able to use the car when it's necessary. So the result is, I think today, even before we get to autonomous vehicles, there's a certain amount of tension happening in the distribution and sale of vehicles. Manufacturers want to begin selling cars in new ways, online, maybe fixed prices, different types of owning it. At the same time, dealers want to be part of this new way of doing it, but they want the innovation to occur at the dealer level, not be mandated by any manufacturer on how these innovations need to occur. The dealers want the innovation to occur in such a way that protects the role of the dealer as it exists. So into this environment comes the autonomous vehicle. I think it's important to realize that these autonomous vehicles show up not alone, but with a number of other things happening simultaneously. The first is they're coming into play in convergence with a bunch of new technologies. Vehicles are connected to each other. They're connected to the stoplights. They're electrical. And many manufacturers now can have their vehicles fixed through software updates that happen over the air without the car actually ever having to go to a dealership location. So today you have cars that can drive themselves. They can communicate with each other or you. They can get fueled and they get serviced without ever touching a human being. The second key point is I think these cars are going to arrive at the time when the world is increasingly digital. People want to buy things on their phone. They want to buy it on their computer. They don't really want to buy things in person. Think about the amount of product that's sold and bought over Amazon versus the traditional brick and mortar retailer. The world's changing in that area. And the third thing I think that's important is the cars are going to arrive in a world where we're getting very, very used to sharing services. Airbnb, we share our homes. Lyft, Uber, we share our cars. People don't necessarily own everything themselves, but they want to share what other people own with them for a period of time. So effectively, we're winding up having a world that's very different. The consumers want a world, and the autonomous vehicle is going to show up in a world that's fundamentally different than today. One where consumers maybe are looking for mobility, not necessarily a car. They want a method of getting around, not a thing. They're looking for a service that's provided to them rather than something concrete that they park in front of their house. A very, very different idea of what transportation is about. It is now becoming this idea of a method as opposed to actually something you have to own. So what does all this mean about autonomous vehicles? Will there really be a need for a consumer to own an autonomous vehicle? I mean, again, get on your phone or the chip in your arm that we talked about. Locate a fully charged vehicle. It's driving around your neighborhood. You get in it, you get mobilized to where you want to go, and you're not paying for upkeep or downtime with the car. So this is going to put a lot of questions on the current model for how cars are sold in the US. The questions are going to be whether the current dealer model exists or something different is going to happen. So from the manufacturer's perspective, I think you're going to see the, let me get the right slide here. The issue is going to be what will be the role of the traditional dealer here? I mean, commercially, dealers are going to have a couple choices of what they're going to want to do. They're going to be able to try to continue to maintain their current way of distributing vehicles, or they're going to transform into something different. Are they going to become mobility hubs rather than stores? Are they going to be places where you come in and you actually get a car, but the key is what they're going to differentiate by adding to the car of upfitting it? Or are they going to begin operating fleets in their local areas? Will they begin thinking themselves as service providers rather than as people who buy things? The other dealers who may not adapt may begin thinking about seeking legal protection for what they're doing. Effectively, what these dealers may wind up doing is going to the state legislatures and asking for new laws and seeking redress to the courts to protect their role and their part in the distribution system. So I think this means that there's going to be a lot of interesting questions for consumers. Are they going to be obtaining mobility differently? Or are they going to be in a system that's still locked into the brick and mortar dealer system as it goes forward? So I'm going to end with, I think, a couple predictions of what I think may be happening and how the things will happen. Predictions are really good until basically this hour is over, and then we have to start making new predictions again. But here's what I think you're going to see winding up happening as innovation occurs. I think you're going to see manufacturers trying to sell autonomous vehicles in a whole lot of different ways. I think you're going to see them selling them to the technology providers themselves, who may operate them or license them out. You're going to see more and more sales to fleets. You're going to see more and more sales to the enterprises and the Hertz and the Ubers and the Lyfts of the world rather than individual customers. You're going to see dealers, manufacturers doing that. You're also going to see manufacturers trying new ways to sell cars, a little more digital and online. And I think you're going to see them trying to sell autonomous vehicles through the traditional dealer network as well. I think on the dealer end, you're going to see dealers beginning to experiment with new business models themselves. They're going to start having to look for partnerships in their distribution scheme as well. So I think what you're also going to find out then is ultimately dealers are either going to adapt or legal battles will occur. And I think we're going to find a world where there's going to be commercial movement on one side and legal movement on another. And we're going to see ultimately how cars get sold when they're autonomous. It's going to begin gradually, but I think at some point we could get a critical mass of autonomous vehicles where things happen really, really quickly. And the world changes very, very fast. With that, I want to hand this back to Kevin Long in our Milwaukee office.
Thanks very much, Randy. I'm going to give you about 45 seconds on a litigation update and then take some questions. As has been referred to throughout the presentations today, there's ample opportunity here for litigation in various places. The one that everybody thinks of is, okay, what's going to happen when somebody gets in an auto accident? That's going to dramatically change because you've got another actor, you've got software, you've got things in the pipeline there. All 50 states have different joint and several liability rules, things are going to be different there. We talked about the various IP and non-compete disputes that are going to be there. Randy has referred to the dealer and distribution channels. You're also going to see government issues. It's a matter of public record that we presently represent a company called Bird Rides, Inc., who's been sued by the city of Milwaukee with respect to scooters here in the city of Milwaukee, automated scooters, and or motorized scooters, I should say. And that's an example of government and industry needing to work out systems where technology is moving very quickly, government laws aren't always catching up. I can't say anything more about that, but you'll see, I think, more of those type issues cropping up and opportunities for dispute resolution. So with that, I am going to take any questions. First one, I begin in Chicago. Are there any questions in Chicago? Anything here in Milwaukee? I've got one question. Anything in any of the other offices that are on? The question that one question that has come in is, we have two actually. One is, will we soon see absolute liability for the owner of the vehicle in auto accidents with autonomous driving cars? There's a lot of discussion about this, that it may become sort of a no-fault situation where it becomes like a workers' compensation insurance policy, or everybody buys in and pays a particular amount. The insurance industry is certainly looking at this very, very closely, and everybody's trying to figure out where things are going. And that's certainly an issue that's definitely a possibility. The last question we have relates to Mark Ehrman, and whether or not Mark Ehrman actually said on a video that he would drive his car into a group of children rather than the back of a vehicle. And I think that I don't think that was a fair characterization of Mark's testimony, and I'm going to instruct him not to answer any further questions with respect to that issue.
I'll defer to my attorney for that. Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you very much, and please do feel free to follow up with any of the folks on our automated connected vehicles team. It's in your materials, or your Quarles and Brady lawyer, and thank you very much for your time today.